Hello everyone and welcome to day 2 of the event. I hope all of you enjoyed the super insightful and exciting sessions of yesterday. I certainly did. I especially love the stories of enterprises across the world using Seclore to solve the next generation of security challenges. As the VP of Engineering at Seclore, I am thrilled to be working on the bleeding edge technology of data security. My team of super smart, super enthu engineers are looking forward to deliver on the promise of the product shared yesterday. It is absolutely humbling for Seclore to solve problems for some of the largest enterprises in the world, and I appreciate the trust you have placed in us. Moving on, we have a series of very exciting sessions planned today. We have 2 panel discussions, one with industry experts talking about collaboration challenges of highly regulated industries, and another one, equally interesting, with security entrepreneurs talking about how data is becoming the only option for security. We also have a fireside chat with Mr. Hamid from PIF Saudi Arabia. As we all know, PIF is the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, and he would be relating his experience of managing their data security. I hope all of you enjoyed today's sessions. Welcome again to SecurityNow 2021.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us for a discussion on an interesting topic today: how to balance the demand between cloud collaboration and data security, especially in heavily regulated industries and scenarios where regulatory requirements dictate how much data can flow, where it can flow, etc. Sort of like having your cake and eating it as well. Joining me today are 3 distinguished panelists who will share perspectives on this topic. Our first panelist is Monil Nacker. Monil is the Director of Identity Access Management at Applied Materials. He is an expert in the security world. He has tremendous experience in both providing vision and implementation to all fields of IT and security, including access and identity management, data governance, BI, IoT, and others. Welcome, Monil. Our second panelist is Rob Oden. Rob is an experienced cybersecurity architect who's currently the senior manager in the data protection and investigations team at L3Harris. In this role, he's responsible for policies, processes to protect regulated information and also support internal cyber investigations. Welcome, Rob. And our third panelist today is Evgeny Karam. Evgeny is the VP of Solution Architecture at Harjavik Group, and a broad experience in many industries, included regulatory constrained industries. In his role, he designs security solutions for clients for both current and future needs. Evgeny is also a thought leader who runs his very own, very well-respected security podcast on security architecture and aims to help other companies improve their security postures. Welcome, Evgeny. So let me jump right in. I look forward to a great conversation, and I'm going to jump right in and have my first question for you, Monil. Applied Materials operates in, I think, 17 countries, and I think 5 out of 6 continents or something. So each of these different jurisdictions must have some regulatory challenges that come with this sort of broad spread. I wanted to sort of understand from your point of view how this international sort of infrastructure for Applied Materials brings its own challenges for regulations, and also specifically within data security and rights management, and how that might be suitable for some of those uses.
Thanks, Vishal. When you talk about all the countries we operate in, it's actually a lot more, especially where people may stay because of remote work.
Sure.
And take a look at it from that aspect. There's always concerns about GDPR, EU requirements, regulations. Now China with their new privacy rules that they're trying to come up as well, and the implications of all those. The key thing is we always want to be the safest choice, and the safest choice means a lot. And it goes from the idea when we give out these requirements or regulations, we have to be compliant. And where does DRM, I think that's the real question, where does collaboration fall into this?
Sure.
Collaboration is key. we operate in fab industries. What that means is huge fabs. Our suppliers have to communicate to each other. Our customers have to communicate to each other. And communicating in a secure manner is very important. And the idea of DRM is to make sure people have the right access, but it also gives the data, the ownership to the data, to the owner itself. And when you take a look at that, that's the key aspect in all these areas. You can even take any PII, any information, and the owner is actually owned by the data itself who created it. And we have lots of regions, lots of requirements over collaboration itself. And if you break it down, and if I was going to break it down in multiple ways, we have to meet the regulations, and the way to protect the data, keep it private, and the people have consent, and cross mingling or cross border transfers, all those things. When we think about DRM actually fits in a place where it kind of meets those requirements in a nice way.
Sure.
And when we set up our collaborations sites and everything else, as much as we can, we apply DRM, and especially around export laws. Export laws into China, the controls that we need to have in place, that's exactly where some of these DRM controls are put into place.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps. It helps a lot, and it helps. And I wish it was more proliferated. And those are some of the things we're working on as part of it.
Well, I'm wondering, when you say DRM, the moment you say DRM, my mind kind of blowing about users complaining that it cannot work because they always need to manipulate documents. So how is your company actually working with this part?
Anytime you add encryption, it adds user inconvenience, right? It's an overhead for performance. You're absolutely right. The users always complain, in my point of view, about some of these things. And one of the things that we've wanted to do is to make it seamless. We focused on user experience first. And if you take a look at the way we integrated with technology, and we have a lot of work to do, by the way, it's not anywhere close, because it's always easier to get the document's native format. And a user will always choose the simplest path possible to get that data to their customers or whatever it is. But the big thing I see in cybersecurity world, or even in our customers are asking for security now. Our customers are asking, our suppliers are asking, hey, let's make sure we're secure. They're putting the mandates on us. They're asking us to do that. So when it comes to now the performance question, it is a performance issue, but we want to make it a native experience as much as possible. So when we use technologies, and I don't know if I'm allowed to use buzzwords here, right? But when we use technologies or systems, we make sure it's a native experience. Like, for example, Seclore is built into that native experience, or whatever DRM is built into that native experience, so the user does less work. It may take longer to read, but it takes less work for them to update, download, view, and do everything else. At the end of the day, the customer and the supplier and the partners that we deal with appreciate it. And that's where I see the performance hindrance or the acceptance going lower. That's what happens in our ecosystem.
Sure. And do you see a lot of the requirements are driven by the customers, Monel, or is it primarily sort of internal awareness of the needs for doing this?
In our space, it comes both ways.
Sure.
When we sign something called a NDA or some other NDAs associated with our customers, they actually give us guidelines on how they want to protect that data, and making sure the right people view that data who signed the NDA in some cases, right? You look at M&As, right? In particular, all NDA based, and who can see the data and access it. If you look at all these other use case scenarios, and I use use case scenarios in the context because it's the way we solve problems, right? We're not getting something and saying, hey, let's apply it. No, these are the problems we're trying to solve. And that's how some of these cases are there. So it's coming both ways. And we have our own program to be the safest choice. And that's where being the safest choice means we also encourage and they also encourage. It's a good partnership.
Great.
It's actually interesting for that, but how old some of the organizations that you're finding? Because in my experience, aerospace and defense, right, we're talking 30, 40, 50 years of even legacy, either data, processes, way that we've shared, either data sovereignty, restricted data for your export control, or data that is confined based off of who paid for it or where. So you have into association that this type is different than this. One of the challenges we've had, you talk about the pain point in Secure, is there's a lot of manual processes that have been built out over the decades to enforce and encapsulate that either data sovereignty or regulation. And then they're already used to the frictionless, if you will, even though there's a manual process from that. How do you, are you seeing that from like legacy, not just systems, but processes and workflows that DRM or IRM or using DLP, whatever you want to go with it, starts either breaking or you have to rewrite completely because it doesn't do a one-for-one for those workflows, and they're comfortable, that's what they know, versus the pain point of transitioning, which would be ultimately faster, quicker, and more secure.
Yeah, you know, that's exactly correct. When you deal with older companies, you have either the source code lost, whatever you have in the whole ecosystem, right? You have ways people do business, and it doesn't want to disrupt business. And you know, when we started the program, and we're looking at this model, and we're evolving it. Please don't get me like we're there. We take use case by use case, right? And we're evolving it. And one of the key things we said is, let's take a look at each of the way data comes in and each of the way data goes out. And in a lot of cases, DLP, DRM, all these things are based on one key aspect: tagging. And doing what we want to do with tagging and enterprise tagging. And that's something that we want to take a look at, because a lot of files, and Michelle knows this, as Seclore and most DRM or DLP, they don't support certain file types. We get like step files, we get like weird files, we get files, right, CLAF files that don't even exist, that I didn't even know these acronyms existed, right? And the reality is, can't be protected everywhere, but we are finding ways to tag them. Because those are legacy processes. Those are business-related processes that we need to integrate with. And what happened is, in our environment, it was a mandate. You know, we got to take a look at all these processes that are part of the business. The higher you go upstream, the better it becomes. Because if you're building this in, you know, hey, this is the program we want to go. We're building this with our partners, our business partner, our organizations, and saying, hey, let's help you become safer. And you know, it has pros and cons, because they understand. Let's say something different as well. The customers are coming in saying, "Hey, why are you not doing it?" Those processes need to change now, right? That technology footprint also needs to change. So the pressure is coming in multiple ways, where they have to do. They're kind of, I won't say they're put in a path of protecting data at the highest level.
Got it. Thanks, Paul.
Did that make sense, Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Question for you, Evgeny. You've been working with a number of different organizations, advising, consulting, large ones, I'm sure, and I've seen probably a diverse maturity of cloud adoption. I want to sort of hear your perspective on what are some of the challenges you see, how companies are doing it right, especially ones that have regulatory challenges. What sort of differences do you see between these companies?
It's a very good question. And as we say in the industry, depends a lot. I spend quite a lot of time with financial sector in Canada and US as well. And it's quite different. So first of all, for many of the companies, the financial sector, people afraid to put the data in the cloud. Not everyone, the engineers always want to push everything to the cloud, but the regulation, not always. So in some cases, you required a lot of signatures. You required a lot of people in committee in the cloud to review what you want to do. Third-party assessments, vendor assessment come to effect to understand where do you put the information, where is the data will be. Especially in Canada, people really don't want the data to leave Canada, especially the financial one, because there's quite a lot of speculation and understanding where the data will be. So in many cases, it's easier to sell vendors on-prem versus vendors in the cloud. But everybody understands this is where the industry is going, and they understand they will have to build a path, build a framework to make it happen. And one of the solutions is vendor management, third-party assessment. You already know you guide the vendor, you need ISO in some cases, you need SOC 2 compliance. This is what else you need to show the enterprise that you're cloud ready, that you have all the certifications you need to make sure the customer is happy. So the sales cycle become longer for certain vendors, the implementation become longer. There's also a lot of questions about SLA, because the moment you put your data in a cloud, you cannot put 2 firewalls, 2 routers, 2 switches, multiple databases. You need to rely on vendor will give to you. So you need to double check, triple check exactly what they claim. How many nines are there? What does it mean if they're going down? What does it mean that they have a bug and they're going to lose your data? Also, by definition, we kind of expect in the cloud, the positive part, that you always going to be on the latest version. In the moment they release a new feature, in a day, week, or even less, you will get this feature. While on-prem, it will take much longer. Now, in some cases, it may be a problem, because if you're not ready for this feature, if they're moving too fast, you may not want it right now.
Sure. Understood. And
I
is
live
there
that world painfully.
Go ahead, Rob.
I say I live that world painfully. Our developers, even the U.S. government says, "Hey, I want you to, be cloud first, be all this other stuff." Except the most protection and the mindset is on-prem first. On-prem is where we own, we control, we can accredit, we can attest that your data that you've given us, that you maybe or may not have marked or told us is sensitive or not, is protected, and we can go through the entire workflow of what we done, how we done, where we did it. And we are, even in our industry, which has been a lot more conservative for going cloud first, is having to kind of try to leverage, but it is kind of a balance for, there's a lot more trust, there's a lot more, even for looking into incidents, whether that's a data spill, lateral movement of your data, whatever thing you're trying to go into, you don't have the same visibility control process that you're familiar with, especially if you've been a primarily or very aggressive on-prem establishment. Yeah. And so not only is the technologies or the protections, but there's also kind of mindsets and just comfort levels that for some of the more conservative, larger organizations, we're still in early 2000s, 2010s type mentality where we're living in a 2020, going into 2030 world. So it is an interesting challenge, and especially because, as Monique has mentioned earlier, more and more countries are being more attentive to data sovereignty restrictions and being descriptive of what that means, and data privacy on employees, on your customers. There's a lot more attention, even in the States. And, there's 50, almost independent little nations here that are defining their own privacy rules, that are putting their own regulations. And for most of us organizations that are in multiple things, even if you only have a few employees there, they're like, wait a minute, you must now have to do this. So it is a challenge to go and say, hey, the best and greatest tools are over here, but the restrictions and requirements for either our regulatory agencies or even the protection requirements is very much still built in an on-prem world, especially because most of the people who are going to attest that we are doing the things we need to do, they themselves still have an on-prem mentality and an on-prem of like, hey, here's my checklist, this is what I'm expecting you to have. And that just isn't the same world when you're going more cloud focused or more cloud reliant.
Rob, you kind of adding an interesting Pandora box, because I saw customers that literally decided not to expand in certain countries because of the regulations.
Yeah, it is a brand. I think the next 5 years is going to be really interesting for a lot of organizations, especially because there is not a unifying, agreed upon either standard requirement. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, is that the more to do data protection, you have to know what kind of data that you have. You have to be much more granular, you have to be much more specific. And when you do that, then more people are going, wait a minute, you have that data? I gave you that? Oh, no, I don't want that shared over here. And so there was a famous lawyer in cybersecurity who had this great quote. I'm blanking on his name, but he said, you never want to go from ignorance to negligence overnight. And so having those more familiarities, at least it's on-prem, I can say, I own that versus, oh, I now found that I have your data over here in this place that I don't control. And then I didn't assess them to that level because we thought the risk was much lower than it is. And then having to have those conversations. So again, it's going to be the next fun 5 years because this is more and more companies are going to have this, even for more cloud focused companies, as people go and become more understanding of the data, the sensitivity, the requirements, and the restrictions that are changing, based off the host country that they're in. They're going to have to start reevaluating, oh, wait a minute, where is not only our data, but the data that we're holding and processing for other people? And does the environments that we did a security assessment a year ago, 2 years ago, what have you, is that still relevant based off of the laws, based off of our understanding of the data, and based off of now the sensitivity of that data? It's a fun game. It's going to keep us employed for a long time as practitioners.
Yeah, again, you said something really interesting. As soon as you mentioned it depends, you spoke just like a lawyer. That's what I always hear.
It rubs off, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. You actually are correct, and all these requirements does help if you take a look at it from SOC 2 to all these things and all the regulations that they meet. But at the end of the day, it's about trust, and that is the key aspect. Not only internally, externally, everywhere else, we have to make sure that we have trust, because without that, that's the core that holds everything associated with where we put the data.
Sure.
Zero trust or just trust?
Distrust.
I thought we said we're not going to use buzzwords.
That's good.
Yeah,
you're right.
You can use anything. No, I think you said, Rob, you said 2020 going on 2030, right? That's sort of the defense industry, so to speak. I was curious to see, what is the state of cloud collaboration in your industry, and sort of what are the major issues that you see trying to grow and get to 2030 from your current state, right? That's, what do you think?
So first and foremost, the U.S. government is trying to define and do better, more data centric for the data. So they're pushing the controlled unclassified information type label. There has always been the export, EAR, ITAR type data set. But they're saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't classified, which they have a very well-defined process, but this still needs to be sensitive, and there's still some controls. So there's a growing pains for that, for more the data centric side. There's also the side for the DoD itself is saying, hey, we're falling behind on some of our development. We can't leverage DevOps or SecDevOps or all these elements that they want to go into and the speed they want you to go into. But we also live in a very tactile world, and the cloud that in the private and public sector is an always on environment, right? Where if you're in a cloud, there's an expectation that there's always some type of communication. And a lot of the environment that we have is that we're having to develop either things that are purposely air gapped, meaning that there is not communication, there's not air gap, or in environments that are heavily restricted on the amount of communication, such as low bandwidth, or purposely disconnected, such as warfighter machines or things like that you're trying to control the environment. Right? The Internet of Things is really good because it could beacon back, but we all live in the world that we're trying to develop and build at the Internet of Things speed, but yet live in a manufacturing, it's going to be disconnected. So there is a balance of trying to say, how do we do this, kind of leverage the tools out there, and at the same time, being expanding of what we say, hey, this is this data. If you work on it, develop with us. Well, the US government has about 500,000 contractors, right, in some levels. Does that mean me as L3 Harris has 50,000 people? Or does that mean that the guy with the 25 people that also has an element of this data, because they have to make this very individual specific widget, that we don't want that information getting out? And I think it's a good effort, but it is almost, it's ridiculous, the level of scope. Now, there is an effort with CMMC to try to, going back to the comments that were made earlier, right? How do we get to that level of trust? How do we get to a standard that we can all come and say, hey, they are building, growing, and level setting across the playing field? which hopefully that can get us to. We're also working with a lot more cloud vendors or getting more cognizant of, hey, there are some additional requirements, again, for data sovereignty, for privacy concerns, for, these restrictions that, just because I work with a Canadian company, they're not going to be very comfortable with me storing their data in a US government restricted environment. Like, how do I have those exchanges? So overall, it is coming and being flexible, if you will, working very, so for me as a cybersecurity architect, anytime I bring in a vendor, I lay out, here are the challenges up front. And then what can we do? How can we work? And then either helping them get to either accreditation or putting security controls that would make us comfortable or our customers comfortable, that we can show we're doing due diligence, due care, or saying, hey, we can't use you over here, but maybe this element that's more commercial in nature, or working with another government that is more in line with that, then we do it more of a surgical response. But when we are looking at trying to balance kind of the enterprise, large scale efficiencies, but at the same time having these very specific requirements that are growing, not only for the number of them, but our understanding of them, we're having to approach it at a very surgical level on use case by use case by use case versus trying to do something blanket. It is, again, it's like developing a SOAR platform, right? You don't start off by saying, I'm automating everything. You start off with like 5 things you're going to try to say X, Y, and Z. We're going to automate by the end of the year and maybe get 2 of them. And then the year after that, you're going to 50, and the year after that, you go to 100. But that's kind of where we are now, is finding the balance, finding where we can, when he says, is do the sharing and the trust, right? Trusting the environment, but it's building that trust is where we're kind of struggling, if you will. And as well as building the trust between tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of companies that have different level of understanding of what's expected of us. And in a changing federal government regulatory environment that is also not really well defined, kind of like a SOX or something along those lines, that are saying, this is what you're gonna do every time. It's, we think this is what we're gonna do, but hit us up in about 3 to 6 months, and we might have more information from you.
Right.
Rob, you mentioned air gap environments.
That's my.
I was going to ask the same question. Well, I was going to say, I think someone here might have some thoughts to share on air gap.
No, I'm just saying it's a general question. Air gap environments and cloud are like 2 opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially when you want them to talk to each other.
Or try to leverage DevOps principles in a cloud, in an air gap network, because the whole idea is the people who build it are people who are maintaining it. If you don't have connection, you can't maintain what's.
It's a huge challenge, and I think I understand what you mean by that, because breaking into that mainstream mentality that the cloud maybe can answer it, maybe we can build an air gap in the cloud itself, right? Those are the challenges that face, I think, your industry and our industry as well, where air gap is such a predominant or environment that our customers live in, or we live in a data side.
And going back to that, so DRM, I love DRM, but the problem with DRM is you can't authenticate, you can't unlock.
Yeah.
And if you're air gapped, you can't communicate back to authenticate. Now, we've been having some interesting conversations about what we can do to kind of move that authentication closer to our on that other side. But there's still that trust relationship, is that you have to bridge that gap.
Sure.
And that authentication, which is where you get your control, where you get your protections, where you get your disseminations, it's not the same world in an always connected or I can connect world that cloud provides to a lot of the non-air gap world.
Right.
Yeah, Rob mentioned this. One of the first use cases we give Seclore was air gap.
Yeah. Yes, and I have to say that Rob and Seclore have also been discussing some air gap solutions. So we understand this is a hot topic for a lot of our key customers. So, but it's a challenging problem. I think the question of how do you bridge that trust gap through air gap networks, it's not an easy question to answer. There'll have to be some innovations that we'll have to do together to solve that problem. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, Monil. A question for you. is on the recent sort of change we've all seen in work from home. I mean, you have an organization with tens of thousands of people as well. What unique challenges did this sort of necessitation of being away and being remote, being working from home, throw at you guys? And really, how did you think through it? And what technology did you end up employing? Anything new that you've deployed for meeting these use cases?
Yeah, I think COVID, you're talking about COVID. COVID-19 was probably one of the tragic, is a pandemic that's going on, tragic to people's
Sure.
families, members, emotionally, physically, a drain that, has taken the toll on the employee base. Everybody, kids even, right, and what they want to do. And the first thing we had to realize, as a company, we had to realize first, people first, right? The emotional train. So we wanted to make, if you're talking about policies and process, people first.
Sure.
And I think the first thing you have to understand, we're saying, let's make it easier for them to work from home. Let's see what they need to do to work from home. A lot of the things we moved to the cloud. For example, let's say a secure web gateway, right? Instead of having it on premise, put it on the cloud. So when they work from home, it's faster. The performance meets their requirements, right? There's a lot of changes. Actually, COVID-19, I believe, changed the ecosystem of IT. People working from home, collaboration, online collaboration, Zoom meetings, right?
Sure.
How efficient we've become, and how also, emotionally and physically strained by working all the time has also become, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of caveats to it. We made a lot of changes. And then you take a look at it from the other spectrum. Security itself has been going, cybersecurity and issues with that has been going drastically up. They've been exploiting people working from home. So if you take a look at it from a security standpoint, we had to make the countermeasures from people working from home. Our practices had to change, saying, hey, working from home, how does it benefit the people? And how can we protect it against these threats that are there in the environment and ecosystem, which is growing because people are working from home. Of course, if you're talking about other things, monitoring, we had a team just to monitor, people working from home, making sure people are efficient working from home.
Sure.
That not looking at the caveat the other side. How can we make it easier or more efficient for them working from home?
Right.
So we increased the monitoring and making sure in both cases are there, and making sure people have the ability to work from home. Being flexible also is a key aspect, because now they're teachers, they're workers, they're parents, they're doing all the things that they need to do, and flexibility and all those items. And monitoring became a requirement that we had, advanced monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say what solutions we put into place, but we put a couple of solutions in place to make sure we can do that.
Great.
And if you take a look at it, ensure that we don't have any loopholes, or we don't have any threats that are coming in that we didn't accommodate for, because you still have to be vigilant. You still have to be ready, because those are increasing. The number of items and threats and agents that exist have just increased exponentially during this time. So the monitoring, the capability, the automation, all have to increase based on where COVID brought us to.
Right. Understood. I think, Evgeny, for you, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
No. So I was just saying, it's just interesting from that. I also build out a lot of the tools and capabilities for insider threat, and my team does the initial analysis for ethics, CI, across the board. We have a really good partnership with that. Again, because prioritization of data and then who's using that data, right? They go hand in hand a lot of times. And it's just been really interesting in our own experience especially for organizations that have been much more perimeter focused or perimeter first,
right,
with their security, and that we had to change and pivot very quickly. Just the behaviors of what's abnormal and not abnormal, because that's another thing of how we protect our data is,
Mm-hmm.
looking for trends and patterns. And, printing from home being something that used to be a big red flag. Now it becomes normal because, a significant portion of our population is from home, and that's how they do their work. There was a case that I was familiar with where this was before COVID, someone had downloaded onto a local network sensitive intellectual property and some, a customer's data to work from home, and their network was compromised. And then the person who had compromised their home network had that data and was reaching out to the company to say, hey, we have your data and we're going to release it unless you give us money. And they didn't hack the company, they hacked the local network that a person just downloaded to their Synology or whatever they had, because it didn't have the same billions of dollars of security stacks that we as an organization. So it's definitely a softer target, and the data is definitely much more exposed. But as you mentioned, we gotta be supportive of allowing people to do the jobs they need to do, and really pivot in ways that, for those of us more legacy mindsets, have had to struggle. And not only have we had to go and say, look, there's more threats, as you mentioned, speak that up, but also really put some tools, techniques, and processes in place to accommodate not only the growing threat, but also our customer base. So yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and it's been a pain that we've lived over these last 18, 19 months.
I want to add something.
No, go ahead.
From my perspective, like, we see a lot of our customers struggling with the flow of data. As you mentioned, if you work from home, both you or Manil, where do I go with my data? Is it go to a cloud? Do I browsing the website? Do I need to connect back with remote access to my environment? Do I tunnel my traffic, or do I use web gateway in the cloud? There's many companies that solve this problem right now. From a managed service perspective, in the Hergery group, as Rob, as you mentioned, I used to see several IPs. Now I see a variety of IPs coming to me. So are you a bad guy that trying to download my information, or you just a guy that trying to do your job, or you need these files for you? And there's a very interesting point that we start discussing in the beginning of this year, and because not everybody is still working back in the offices, we still don't know. How do we safely bring employees back to the office? Do we scan the laptops before they connect to the office? What exactly we need to do? There's a lot of ideas and problems and variety of solutions here.
Right. And Evgeny, follow-up question for you is the perimeter sort of first thought process versus data first thought process. Have you seen in your clients sort of a shift, or do you expect to see a shift, or what's your thought process on the perimeter dissolving and then data really coming to the forefront?
So interestingly enough, I literally today was looking at some of the presentation I did, and I found a presentation from 2018 that called Beyond Perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't called SASE during the days. There was no term for this. Now Gartner have a term.
Yes.
I definitely see, because we use Office 365, because we use Salesforce, because we use Dropbox, and many, many, many other tools that are no longer inside the perimeter, that the perimeter in my mind is everywhere. And funny enough, sometimes we do consulting work or workshop for a customer, and we ask them, so do you use cloud? Like, no, we don't have cloud. Half an hour after, there's Office 365, there's Salesforce. They're just so used to use this that they forget it's actually a cloud. So definitely there's a big shift towards data, towards where is my data is going, who have visibility to this data versus just perimeter. Now, perimeter still exists. If you are a company that has a website and you host the website internally, this is your perimeter. It's just a bit different perimeter. I always say that there is people inside the company that need to do their work. And then there's one set of security controls. And there's my data centers, or what do I do to serve my customers? Going to be a bit different. This perimeter exists. We still going to have DDoS protection, WAFs, firewalls, and many other things. Botnet management, API was mentioned here multiple times. That will still be here for quite a long time, or it will be on-prem in the perimeter and in the cloud as well.
Right. And Rob, how about you? Have you seen this sort of shift in your organization for perimeter, I know, versus data, or is that something that is not yet on the radar?
So no, it's definitely a conversation. And our organization, actually one of the reasons for bringing me on about 4 years ago, was our CISO and our board of directors knew that we had to identify, segment, prioritize our data. We just couldn't treat everything the same. And absolutely, but there really isn't an enterprise way to do that and to do it consistently, accurately, and at speed of workforce, right? Again, that's what I meant from SOAR, because I was working with the men and women on our team who are developing it out. And it is an iterative and painful process, especially if you've made investments in workflows, technologies, whatever have you. Now, I hate the perimeter is dead marketing speech, because it's not. It's going to be here forever.
Sure.
But the perimeter will change, was just mentioned. Your perimeter is your area of control. And we're going to have to relook at how we look at perimeter and not perimeter. But then there's also, there will always be some that element of that, because we'll always want some type of control, whether we pay someone else to do that control or we enforce that control ourselves. But the data itself, and then being responsible, not just what we do with the data, but what our suppliers do with the data, what our customers do with the data, or access to the data, so forth and so on. Our suppliers do with the data. That is starting to be something that our customers are requiring on us. We are working with our peers in industry. I meet weekly with the Big 10, and we share, like, how would we do this? But again, we have to do this at scale. It is very easy to do this a couple different use cases. But once you start looking at organizations that have tens to hundreds of business units, and each of those business units trade, share, and modify data in very different ways, in very unique ways. That might be dependent on the customer, might be dependent on their legacy processes, might be dependent on what they're developing on. That is where we are looking like, yes, we need to do this, but it's such a large elephant that myself and my peers, we're really looking at where do we start and how do we start chipping away. But we're going to be kind of a step behind organizations like the financial industry that has been a lot more specific, because there's a initiative to dollar sign. And as well as the other limitations we talked about, is we can't leverage the greatest and the cloud-based tools to throw it to Google and they'll process it and give me the perfect solution. We're going to have to do this, and we're going to have to be incremental. And that means anytime you do incremental, I'm always going to be dragged a little bit by my legacy processes, equipment, and approaches. And it's almost twice as expensive to do both things in both worlds, because that's the world that we live in. And unless we have someone who says, thou shalt do this on this day, it's going to be kind of this pain point that we're going to kind of drag out to get to that more data-centric view of security. But that perimeter, that on-base security, all of that, that's not going away. At best, it will mature and integrate the things that we have reliances on, but that's going to stay. But in parallel, there's also going to be, where is our data? What is our data? Who are we responsible for that data? And what kind of controls can we place on that data at scale that we're not going to break our more manual, our legacy processes? And then eventually, I hope we can have as we say in the South, a come to Jesus conversation with ourselves and our businesses to say, are our workflows holding us back from being able to holistically better protect our information and meet these requirements? And is it worth the pain to do that transition? And I think that's a conversation we're going to be having over the next, even in my industry, in the next 3 to 5 years, and being it as a business cost to not do this versus a business cost to transition to do this.
Got it. Thanks. I had one sort of. I know we're running out of time. Sorry. Go ahead, Manu.
No, I was going to add something to that. When we talk about perimeter in the past and boundaries of perimeter and perimeter security, it is morphing. It is maturing. And what I see, like you said, is it's more data centric, because in all reality, the data centric perimeter is there. Because if it's in the cloud or some other ecosystem, air gap, that data needs to be protected through its lineage. And what Rob mentioned was lineage, which was key part, because it's not how we take the data in one place, it's how it's morphed, how it's transformed, where it goes to, how it goes to them. That tracking has to be there for the data lineage side. And that's where data-centric security and perimeter is actually part of that whole ecosystem of security, perimeter, and everything around the data itself. That's the core asset.
Right. Agreed. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to sort of throw a question out to everyone, and feel free to sort of jump in as you see fit. But I wanted each of you to take 30 seconds to a minute and share with us one key innovation or change or sort of new idea come into the data security industry, say over the next, say, 5 years or so. Evgeny, do you want to start or go in any order that you like?
Yeah,
so.
Definitely. So one part we've been talking for the last 40 minutes is digital transformation and security controls as well. And I think we can all agree that when we're in a cloud, the way we build rules, the way we authenticate is by user. So I wish in the next 5 years, the idea of identification of a user will be much easier. We mentioned air gap. How can I open a document if I don't know who is Evgeny? So I want this part to be solved much easier with biometric or any other ways. This way, the moment I know is Evgeny, I can apply things much easier. I can do DRM much easier. I can do many, many other things in much easier and faster way. That's it.
Wanil or Rob, whoever wants to go.
Okay. For me, it's tying in the promise of IRM into a workflow, right? Because that's one of the biggest things is at scale is where we struggle with that, right? It's good kind of large sweep, go thou shalt, yes, no, but being able to tie it in so that individual business use cases can be applied, thought of, applied, and tested and put forward, and that it isn't this management nightmare on, do I allow this? Do I block this? Do I make it easy for my employees to control where data is going? But at the same time, integrate for the specific limitations based off the information or based off of where it's going to. So more context-based on controls versus trying to do DLP rules or trying to go and say, I give the user complete control and then they have to manage it. So doing something that we can kind of tie in that management workflow with key management, where we can be smarter about what we recommend or apply, but yet not get in the way of the user from doing what they need to do, I think would just streamline the entire adoption of more data protections, which in most cases is using encryption to control who can do what with the information. And that's
Thanks, Ron. I just thought about something. Sorry, it just came to my head. Homographic encryption, it's going to make things a lot easier going forward, especially with security and make things easier for everybody on the user side, especially when it comes to the performance we talked about earlier and the ease of use of security products and DRM products and everything else. That's some of the things that that'll really, quantum encryption, whatever it may take. Right. But if you take all those things into the idea, it's to make things easier and more performance on the end user to become more usable and easier for everybody else. I think that's one of the big changes that needs to happen in the next couple of years. I think also this quandary that we live in privacy and security. Okay. If you take a look at it, I can't do certain things because of privacy, but I need to look at it because of privacy and security. And we live in this quandary of this area, and even putting AI in the middle of both of those causes more issues in the privacy side than anything else. I really believe that that's a solution that's going to come as maybe in the future someone should invent it, a privacy as a service into the IoT devices directly, or right into upstream areas where it comes right from the bat fully into a methodology and practice which is accepted in the cybersecurity realm, in the AI realm. And that's one of the things. Other ones I would love to see is, right now, if you take a look at a lot of providers, and they do this, and I'm not going to say the names of the providers, they focus on cyber threats not from external factors. Mm-hmm. A lot. Mm-hmm. They rarely focus it on data-centric protection, right? And data-centric perimeter. And what I mean by that, you take a look at the algorithms that they write. You would say 90% of them are based on external factors. Easiest biggest bang for the buck for the return for those consumers.
Right.
But data-centric one algorithms, when you take a look at it, and then putting AI behind that. Oh, well, Rob sent an email to you, Vishal, and that's perfectly fine. But that data itself was, manipulated this way. It had this lineage, and all those AI tracking of the data itself is not heavily invested in from these security vendors. And I think that eventually that piece is going to start growing a lot faster.
All right, great. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. All these new innovations that are going to come down the pipe. And thank you to all the panelists for taking time out of their busy days and sharing their thoughts with us. And I'm hoping that Seclore will continue to partner with all of you to bring some of these innovations to light one of these days. We really appreciate the time you spent with us, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much for the panel today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Welcome to this session, Fireside Chat, and we have our esteemed guest today with us, Mr. Shahbar from PIF. So PIF is basically the public investment fund from Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's a sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, probably one of the world's largest fund. Mr. Hamid is the Vice President for IT Networks and Security, a very seasoned professional with many security certifications and a long experience in the security domain. So thanks a lot, sir, for your presence and for sharing your views on some of these questions and challenges that the whole security world is facing today. So let me start with maybe if you can just share a little bit about PIF and your role at PIF.
Thank you very much, Abhijit. Appreciate it, really. My name is Hamid Shahbar. I'm heading the IT network and security here in the Public Investment Fund. I started with PIF in August 2019, so almost now I completed 2 years with PIF. You understand now the Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia and how PIF is playing a big role in this vision, where right now we are moving from being an oil country to will be driven by investments, and PIF will help doing this. So I have about 15 years of experience in the IT field in general, and then I specifically started my cybersecurity field also about 6 years ago. So thank you again for hosting me.
Thanks a lot, sir. So that's a really huge goal, I think, that has been set for the country and for PIF. So all the best for that. So there are a lot of enterprises today, if you see, who are spending a lot of time and money on the traditional perimeter-centric security solutions, right? Like securing their IT infrastructure, like devices, networks, applications. So what kind of prompted you to start looking beyond these and embark this journey on centric security?
Yeah, see, as you mentioned, the investment we are doing on security here in the kingdom is huge. And I think one of the most important aspects that we need to look at is the data security. Data security is the trend. Now everybody is moving towards the digital world. So moving towards digital, that means your asset is your data and it's being more exposed. So here we had to look for a way to secure our data. And we needed to make sure that we prevent any leakage that might happen for our data. Also, I think one very important aspect of this that we needed also a way to make sure whoever accesses these data should be the right authorized person to access it. I think that's it. Also, maybe I can add some one more point here that we had the need to watermark our document, because if you're talking about data, it's maybe easy to protect. However, still you need to make sure that there is no alternative way for the attacker or someone who wants to leak your data to be able to get it from you. So we thought that watermarking is a very important aspect of this as well.
Absolutely, and Seclore provides a very dynamic way of watermarking the documents. So yeah, so that's a very interesting approach to security, where you're securing, I think, focusing on data itself rather than securing the infrastructure. So I'm sure there are a lot of confidential data, that you are exchanging with third parties as a part of your these large scale projects that you're executing. So how do you measure or control the risks related to these third party exchanges, and how is kind of Seclore helping you in mitigating those risks?
Sure. So, as you said, I think one of the biggest asset that PIF have right now is its documents. Usually, when I first come to an organization, I try to look of what is the most critical asset in this organization and how can I secure it. So to measure the risk, I sat with the business, I understood their needs, I made sure that I understood that how much is the impact if one document of an investment or one of the legal documents that we have is exposed, how much it will hurt BIF. So then I used Seclore actually to support me with this matter. So rights management is a very important control that we needed to have with the combination of the DLP and the rights management. So we were able to enforce certain policies on our documents, such as like who should view it, who should copy it, who should print it. Also, it gave us the ability to revoke the access at any time. You know that usually employees, they are joining, resigning, and you need to make sure that nobody have access. So we had the ability and the power to revoke the access anytime we want. Also, with the campaign that we did, it helped the user to understand how critical this is and how it's very important to classify, manage the rights on your data, making sure that no one else has access to it.
Right. I completely understand. One of the things that I found very interesting is, there are a lot of organizations who are regulated and they're mandated to classify information, but what you really go beyond classification and work on this classification-driven protection as an approach to data security. So how is kind of, what kind of led to this, and how has it helped you in driving adoption of this kind of technology within the organization?
Sure, classification for sure, it's a very important step of the data security. However, classification by itself, it's not going to help you prevent the data leakage. So classification along with the rights management, this will empower you to have more control on your documents, wherever they are in the world. So for sure, we had a data classification campaign to make this a success. We needed to classify first, but still, we needed the extra layer of the rights management to make it successful.
Right, very well said. And this automation actually has I could see that it has really accelerated the adoption of how the data assets are getting protected within the organization. So that's really great to hear. One of the things that a lot of organizations and especially the security professionals are kind of grappling with is this whole work from home or work from anywhere nowadays, right? Which is driven by the pandemic situation, right? So how did Seclore kind of help you in securing or even monitoring the data that is maybe getting transferred to people's home devices or when people are working from home?
Yeah, so right, the pandemic and the COVID situation, it was a challenge for us. We needed to enable users to work from outside of the organization. At the same time, we wanted a way to secure whatever they are doing from outside. So Seclore actually helped us in this journey. We did a very successful implementation for Seclore before the pandemic. And this helped us making sure that the users, whenever they're outside, their documents are protected and have rights on them. At the same time, we as an organization can manage the rights, can track the documents, to whom it's being shared, who has access to it, should we prevent the access. If we, let's say, noticed someone that is trying to access a document that he or she shouldn't access, we can just by one click instantly provoke the access. So it really empowered us during the pandemic and helped us to secure our data.
Fantastic. That's really great to hear. One of the things, Mr. Hamid, you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of investments that are being made in the security in the kingdom. So, how are these private, different kind of regulations or guidelines from the government are kind of shaping up the data protection strategy for PIF and maybe for other similar organizations in the kingdom?
Yes, in the kingdom, I think the regulations right now are being more and more focused on. Before we had the NCA coming with the ECC, the CSCC also, multiple regulations, multiple controls that needed to be there. We have also now a new regulation coming from the NDMO, which only focus on the data. So we needed to be prepared. We needed to be ready for this. Alhamdulillah, right now, I think we are ready with the help of Seclore. For sure, Seclore has also a very good integration with other systems that we have, and it will help us close all the gaps for these controls.
Fantastic. That's really good to hear, Mr. Hamid. One of the features that at least find very interesting is this whole data visibility around tracking of what happens to the protected data. How has that helped you in your data protection strategy, and how important is this from your perspective?
Yeah, it's. I think as we mentioned this, it's really important to know who is accessing these data and what they are doing with it. So what we did is that we took all the logs from Seclore gathered, and we ship it to our SIM solution. And here we are making sure that this data is not being accessed. Let's say if we found a file that is accessed from a country where it shouldn't, we don't have any business with, then this will raise an alarm. With this alarm, we go back and investigate why this data was accessed from this location of the world and how. So it's really nice that Seclore are providing multiple ways for us to track, and even with specific IPs, I can make sure that no one else is accessing these data. So all of this is being monitored around the clock here in PIF, making sure that our data is safe.
That's really interesting. So thanks a lot for your time, Mr. Hamid. I think we have many large enterprises using our solution. Having somebody like PIF using Seclore to protect state secrets is really something which is really I feel privileged and humbled. So thanks a lot for making us part of this grand vision that you are working on for the kingdom. So I wish you all the best, and if there is anything way we can contribute towards that, it will be our pleasure and privilege. Thanks a lot, Mr. Hamid.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome everyone to this very exciting panel after the very exciting conversation that Hamid and Abhijit had. It was a really insightful session to learn about how the world's largest sovereign wealth fund manages its information security. I'm super excited to be hosting a panel of very experienced security entrepreneurs here on this in this session. Between everyone here, we've got give or take about 100 years of security executive leadership, let's say, behind us. Hopefully that makes us all wiser. It definitely has made me bolder, right? And no pressure for the rest of us, although I think Kevin, you're next, right? And everybody else will be following. No comments on you, Arti.
So this is how this is going to go. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, totally. All right, I'll just introduce the topic briefly. What I'm hoping to get views from this panel is enterprises are spending more and more on security every day, right? Enterprise security budgets have increased on an average by about 27%, according to most estimate year on year, right? That's a lot of increase. But at the same time, information cybersecurity breaches, data breaches continue to rise even more non-linearly, right? More non-linearly compared to the budget increase that enterprises are putting. And the idea here is to really understand, get a view from everybody here on what do they see as the reasons behind that. Infrastructure level security, which today occupies 80 to 90% of an enterprise's security budget, and how the move to data-centric security is affecting the cybersecurity landscape, right? This is about as general as that. I'll start with introducing the panel. I have with me Arti Arora. Arti is the CEO and founder of Titanium. And I'll let Arti introduce herself a little bit and tell us a little bit more about what Titanium does. Arti?
Thank you. So my name is Arti Arora Raman, and I am the founder of Titanium. Titanium is a data protection company, very much on the same side of things as Seclore, Vishal's company here. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But about myself, I have a mathematics background, so very passionate about the algorithm side of data protection. And I also have a passion for bringing that together with big data, because I feel like in our data-centric world, it's really important to be able to effect some of those security controls that we have in the big data context. So performant, inline, real time, easy to use, so that as we move into this highly data centric world with AI and BI and all the data work we do, security actually becomes part and parcel, and it doesn't bring down the pace and progress. So that's my personal passion. At Titanium, we have done exactly that. So we've basically taken this notion of data protection and put it into the data itself, something that's near and dear to Vishal's heart. And we deal on the structured data side of things. So extending encryption to data in use, not just at rest or in transit, but in use, and then making that available in day-to-day practical use cases at scale in the big data context is what Titanium is all about. So I'm sure there'll be more opportunities to sort of weave some of my passion into the conversation, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for having me, by the way. Really excited to be here.
Thanks a lot, Aarti. Thanks for coming over. Next, we have Jim Barkdahl. Jim is the President and Chief Commercial Officer at Axiomatics. Jim, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Vishal. It's a pleasure to be here and appreciate the time. So as you said, I'm Jim Barkdahl. I've been at Axiomatics now here just under 5 months. And we are the leader in ABAC, so attribute-based access control. Super important as we talk about data here today is the role that authorization plays in access to applications and databases in the stack. So as you've gotten to know me, Vishal, one of my kind of spots that's close to my heart has been around policy, right? And the policy that governs organizations. So certainly it's important, as we'll talk about today, the role that policy plays with the access to data. But as we become more and more decentralized, the role that policy plays in who we're allowing into our network and our applications and into our data sources. So Axiomatics is the leader. It's been in business for over 15 years. Super excited to be here with them. And outside of Axiomatics, I've been in cybersecurity for 30 years, so I make up a good portion of your 100-year total. And I'm based out of the Midwest, and just enjoy being here with the panel today.
Thank you, Jim. And Jim has earlier worked with data-centric security companies like Titus and StealthBits and so on, and has a wealth of knowledge on the topic. Looking forward to your contributions, Jim. Next, we have Kevin. Kevin is the CEO of Spirion. Kevin.
Michelle, thanks. And thanks for commenting on my flowing locks as we kicked off this call. So I appreciate that as well. I'm with Spirion. I've been here a couple of years. The company itself is, we're celebrating our 15th anniversary actually this year. And we're doing today what we were doing 15 years ago. The founders set off to protect what matters most. So we are the sensitive data company, and we are focused on those pieces of data in the data column that tie back to the digital versions of you and me. And what Spirion's made our track record on is being able to accurately find data anywhere it lives. So we do structured, we do unstructured, we do it on MacBooks all the way up to things in the cloud. And what we try to do is sort through those giant piles of data, find the stuff that has the highest level of value, find that valuable stuff that has the highest level of actual volume. And then the last piece is we say, how vulnerable is it? So Spirion's had the good fortune of working with Seclore, working with organizations all over the world. And over the last couple of years, we've spent a lot of time, a lot of money, focused on taking what the guys started 15 years ago and really bringing that into the modern age by bringing our legacy product into the cloud and then offering a host of offerings around both data security and data privacy that plug directly back into sensitive data. I am in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is where we're headquartered. I'm actually in our office today. So we are here. I think there's about 6 or 7 friendly souls back there. So we are not back to full capacity. But we do have some people that need an office, so we wanted to make sure that we made it available for them, and I just like coming in. So really glad to be here today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot, Kevin, and it's good to be partnering with you and the Spirion team. All right, let me start off by taking off from where I introduced the topic, which is maybe I'll direct it to Aarti, and Kevin and Jim, please feel free to chime in. Aarti, enterprises are spending more and more on security every day, like I was talking about earlier, but are lesser and lesser capable of defending themselves against breaches. Right? What do you see as the gap? What's going wrong?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and I think that we can break it down a little bit, right? So the amount of data that we use to run our lives and to run the world is increasing exponentially, right? We just have tons and tons of data. This data is processed now on massive platforms. And everything we access these days is all real time. Think like Uber, think like DoorDash, eBay, E-Trade, like all this data is being processed all the time. And so we're security conscious. Lots of companies are security conscious, and they'll try to protect this data, right, whenever they can. And whenever they can is usually on the device, at rest, in a file system somewhere. But in this real-time enormous data processing type of world, we've got this data in use, right? For these services to work, that data has to be crunched and processed, etc. And that represents, in my opinion, the largest gap, right? When attackers come in through trusted paths, right, with a legitimate credential, they're actually cutting through all the protection that I described and coming straight to that data in use. And that represents the largest gap we have. Like, how do we allow companies and organizations to deliver services and run these operations without that exposure? And so that's where I feel like the kind of work that you do and we do and other companies do in identifying this data will help. Because how can you protect something when you can't tell a good guy with a good credential from a bad guy with a good credential, right? So I think that's sort of like one of the fundamental issues, not to mention other things like, if you don't know where your data is, how are you going to protect it, right? So there's like basic things that relate to how much data we have going around and how much of it is in use all the time. So I'll sort of say that because I'm sure other people on the panel have opinions on it, and maybe circle back around with my own thoughts on that.
That's a
Data
topic.
use.
That's a topic which is very close to Kevin's heart here, right? Discovering. Yeah. Go for it, Kevin.
Well, I first of all, I agree with everything Artie just said. And after you get through the access piece, it's then what data are they actually getting access to? And my typical conversation will start with, well, how much data, let it be a CIO, a CDO, a security officer, how much data does your organization have? I go, we have no idea. Exactly. Yeah. If you did, that's changed already since we've started the conversation. Now, how much of that is valuable versus how much is not valuable? Well, since you didn't know the answer to the first question, you don't know the second. So really being able to your original question on breaches, if somebody either exfiltrates or ransoms last week's lunch menu, I don't really care. However, if they have last year's tax returns in my entire payroll, I do care. So really being able to understand the data column of the access and identity story is a critical part. It's the third part that's got to be figured out. So agree with everything Artie said, just put that additional lens on. Not all data is the same. Some data is different and should be protected differently based on its value.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Vishal. I was just going to say, great comments by both of you. I think that one thing at the beginning of your question, though, Vishal, that we have to all make sure we understand, I think, Artie, you raised a great point on that we're all expecting this access in real time, and that's certainly a driver. But all of us as cybersecurity professionals have to also realize the amount of resources that are out attacking this data, because it's so profitable to be a criminal, is only continuing to rise, right? When we look at whether it's foreign government entities that are at it, and then the people that used to be employed by those foreign government entities that are now in the private sector capitalizing off of this, that's continuing to grow at the same time that our expectations of data availability are growing. So it's a huge risk.
Yeah, I mean, another quick thought to sort of throw into that mix is that, you mentioned there's so much investment in security, but why is there a gap? And the question is like, where is that investment? We're almost spending on things we know how to do because that's what we know how to do, right? And we know how to prevent and detect because we've been doing that for a long time. And so we continue to see investment in prevention and detection, whereas our reality is that the average attacker stays in the average company 280 days or something like that, some number like 221, 280, a long time, right? Which means enterprises can safely assume that you got bad guys on your network. But our security investment is about preventing the bad guys. It's not necessarily about dealing with bad guys that are already there. So I think that's a disconnect, right, in the spend.
Yeah, I think the distinction between bad guys and bad action, right, by whether they're bad guys or good guys, right, that distinction that line is not very well drawn. And the only thing that I'd like to add here is that the assumption that there is a good definition of what is a bad guy to start with, right? And not acknowledging the 50 shades of gray, so to say, in the middle, right? Where good guys can turn bad, bad guys can turn worse, and so on. And right, everybody's moving in the spectrum depending on whether they got the next job or not, or whether they have already resigned from the company or not, or whether they are a contractor that has got awarded the contract or not, and so on, right? There are so many things which makes people jump these shades of gray. I think acknowledgement by the enterprises that there is no clear definition of good guys and bad guys. There is only a good definition of what is bad action and what is good action, right? And it could come from anywhere, right?
Yeah, so I think an important part of that too, Vishal, is especially in this post-pandemic world in which we're living, and even during the pandemic, there's a lot of really good people that are trying to do their jobs that are exposing the organization to exponential risk just by trying to do their jobs. They're not bad people doing bad things. They were told to run a report on last week's payroll amount, and they did that. And in the process of doing that, pulled out a whole bunch of data from a system of record that then went from being in a very secure spot to a very insecure spot. Then they emailed it to somebody, but they blind copied themselves, and then they made sure that they went ahead and stored it. Now there's all these copies of it, and they're just trying to do their job, which is where most inadvertent type things happen. That's when what was the S3 bucket in the cloud full of all that sensitive data unprotected for? Well, somebody was trying to do their job. So I think that's part of the equation too, is you've got maybe your shades of gray discussion. You got good folks, you got bad folks, you got bad action, and then you got good people trying to do the right thing that struggle to do the right thing and end up exposing the company to additional risk.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think the comment that you made, Kevin, earlier on just the fact that the number and amount of resources that are going after the data is increasing, perhaps more than the cybersecurity budgets of enterprises are increasing, right? It's not one uniform group of people who are trying to go after the data now. There are everybody from inside of the company to partners and contractors to foreign governments to competitors and so on. Everybody is out there, and they have very different motivations, very different methodologies and so on to get after that data. So just the number of, let's say, checkpoints are increasing so much that enterprises are finding it very difficult, right?
And just to be clear, Jim said that. I'm going to take all credit for the smart stuff Jim said.
All right. Kevin, enterprises today, and this is just a sharp thought, let's say, that I had earlier, which is enterprises today are spending nearly 80% of their security budgets protecting, number one, devices that they don't own, traveling on networks that they don't control, and applications that don't belong to them. Most of it is sitting on the cloud. My analogy to this situation was that it's almost like a renter trying to buy home insurance, right? Homeowners insurance, that is. Do you see this changing at all in the near future? How, if at all?
Well, first of all, every time I hear the everything as a service or it's all in the cloud, it reminds me of, I think it's a meme where a dad's laying on the grass with his son, and they're both looking up at the sky, and the son looks at his dad and he says, "So, Daddy, what are clouds made of?" And he looks at him and says, "Mostly Linux servers, son. Mostly Linux servers." Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
But back to your question with the everything as a service, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Once you extract your infrastructure and your network and your devices, what are you left with as a company? You're left with identity, you're left with access, and you're left with data. So starting to understand that, and I think Artie said it extremely well, once you've been breached, once somebody's in and they can pretend that they're somebody and they've got all the right access based on who they're pretending to be, you got to get back to the data conversation. I always look at it as a bridge. You got identity, you got data, and access is the conduit between them. If you don't understand this really well and this really well, you're building a bridge to nowhere. So I think the focus, which for years has been on identity and access, is now starting to shift to data, and it's overwhelming. And I think Artie said it well too, that it's so overwhelming. In fact, they don't know where to start. They're going to do the things they've been comfortable doing with for years. This is what we do. This is what we were trained to do. And to take a step back and say, holy cow, how much data is flowing in and out of my organization? Where's it going? How's it being used? So we bring the privacy lens into it. And it's more than just what is it, it's what's it being used for? I might have access to it, but I might not have the rights to actually do this thing with it that I'm going to do, which gets you into anonymization and all kinds of other pieces. There's a whole world around data that people are just scratching the surface on. And I think that's got to become the focus versus the perimeter versus the edge. I've got identity, I've got access, I've got data. that's where I've got to spend the limited resources that I have.
Actually, if I can take your question the way you stated it, Vishal, where you said you're spending all of your budget on devices that don't belong to you, on networks that don't belong to you, in applications that don't belong to you. The thing that you do control and own is the data, right? That's almost like the part you didn't state, which Kevin picked up on. And so what choice do you have? You have to put your controls in the data because you don't control anything else. It almost is like the logical conclusion. And maybe that's what you were driving to when you frame the question that way. But that's exactly right? If you can't put your controls inside the data, then you don't have any control of anything else anywhere. It's a bit of an illusion, right? If you think you do with your policies or however it is that you have these models for your networks and your employees and your applications, but the data you do control. So that's like one more vote for data-centric security, I think. Right? Isn't that right?
Yeah, but I was already counting on your votes. So
yes, well, okay, fine. So we have now proved it mathematically, right? That you got more control there. Yeah.
We need more in the tribe here. Right?
Yeah.
Jim, one of the biggest challenges that at least at Seclore, when we talk to security professionals all around the world here, is that security policies are buried in hundreds of different systems that an enterprise acquires over a period of maybe decades that they have acquired on. What hope, if at all, do enterprises have of uniformizing these security policies and taking this bridge analogy that Kevin had earlier said, right? There's identity and there is data, and this bridge is now the security policies, right? Who has access to what piece of information? Historically, if you look at a regular enterprise, I have SAP, I have Box, I have Microsoft, I have email storage all over the place, right? So many different access control methods. What hope do enterprises have?
Yeah, it's a great question. First, a plug for my solution a bit, right? Because we are an amalgamation, a centralized place to put that policy. So to externalize and pull that policy out of the individual applications in the structured data area or the custom applications you're building is a philosophy or a move that now as a NIST best practice, you can take that step, authentication and authorize, and create that policy in one central location. But I think getting to your broader question, I see policy and policy confusion as the #1 CISO complaint and really area that they're always looking for help in. I've got all these compliance and regulatory and audit things that are coming at me, different suggestions. You've got, zero trust being thrown on all over the place now, as every solution says they're a zero trust solution. And I think CISOs are often craving for what is that best practices policy that I can put and kind of run across the board. So the issue you have today is, you mentioned all those applications, all the different business teams, whether it's IT, development, business, they're all doing each their own piece of work inside these applications or with access to data. And then you've got different teams, maybe the finance team or the HR team trying to come up and say, well, we need to do this for this compliance. We're going to run this policy. So you have a lot of conflicting policies, a lot of different needs that people are trying to solve across the enterprise. So I think, as we talk about, for a CISO, what should they really be trying to do? They should be trying to implement practices around the data and the access that both Kevin and already talked about, as if that's their product, because that is their product, right? We're almost always talking about intellectual property and process is what almost every company produces now, right? Ford no longer produces necessarily automobiles. They subcontract out every piece of that development. It's the process and the information about how they do that that's the intellectual property. So if I, as a CISO, take that's my product, and I have to worry about protecting that in a different way, as already said, that's the perimeter. I think that's really the difference.
But don't you think, Jim, that being able to even come up with the right policy is one of the biggest challenges, right? So step one is, for lack of a better word, discovering the policy itself, which right now is not uniform. And then, of course, step two is actually implementing, right? It's like making the constitution and law enforcement, right? So how does one go about making the constitution to start with, right? And then we'll worry about law enforcement. Yeah.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Aarti, Kevin, any thoughts on this? how does the policy get set up to start with, right? We are all good data protection companies, but the CISO challenge is still, hey, how do I even discover whether somebody should have access to this data or not? How do you go about solving that problem?
Yeah, so I have like a two-part stand on that one. One, I feel like what you do by default is really, really important, right? Like, so earlier it was okay to kind of by default have access to things and then restrict access based on your policy. But the default state was unprotected. And this is true, like I'm from the structured data world. This is true in databases today, right? An admin that has access to a database usually has access to everything in clear text because that's what admin access to a database means. And so that when the default is clear, is unsecured, and then you put access policy on top of that to say, hey, who gets to see what? So first for me is let's flip the default. Let's say the default state is secure. No one has access to all 100 million records in a database. No one has access to all files in a file share, right? So that's a default policy. After that, the question is who gets to see what? And that, in my opinion, is a complex combination of privacy policy, company policy, sort of like your matrix of resources and roles and permissions. But, and that is actually not my expertise, but I feel like you need both. You sort of need the default to be flipped, and then you need some sort of a policy framework that allows people to basically say, what that resource authorization should be.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Two things to piggyback on that. That I like your here's the Constitution, here's your law enforcement. Understanding that there's humans in that mix and understanding how much friction you can actually introduce into that policy is an important part of the equation. Because I can go ahead and say, here's a perfectly written policy, and I'm going to go ahead and orchestrate that policy with the controls. And as soon as somebody gets frustrated with it or they can't do their job with it, they're going to find a way to work around it. So, or maybe they can't work around it because we've done such a good job enforcing it, they can't do their job in the first place. So understanding those elements of policy, I think, is a really important part, that there's humans that are having to deal with the policy and understanding their workflows. And then the other part, which goes back to Artie's point on the privacy world, is data minimization in the first place. So we talk about all the data, but what am I collecting? Why am I collecting it? Is really what all the privacy regulatory laws are about. But if I understood what I'm collecting, why I'm collecting it, it's going to minimize out the gate. But right now I've got so much data that's been replicated. How do I get that footprint minimized so that I'm dealing with just the data that matters versus that inadvertent 300 terabytes of stuff that escaped my control because I didn't know where it was because I did a cloud migration, but I forgot to delete it off the servers that I migrated it from. And now I've got this huge at risk. So data minimization is key, and then making sure it's the right level of policy that the organization and process can bear without overdoing it, because otherwise it's going to get worked around. And if it's too light, it's not going to get you the security you need. So it's finding that balance.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. I sort of want to comment on that a little bit, right? So in my world, what I'm saying is Titanium, by the way, allows you to search and process, manipulate data without decryption. That's what we do. So you can have a database that stays encrypted. You can still search it and run it and serve your application. So in my world, what I'm saying is always on encryption in use for everything. So now you have a policy, right? By default, you have a policy on everything. Now you start managing by exception. So if you combine this idea with what Kevin just said, right? First off, don't have that much data. Whatever you have, always have it encrypted, unstructured with Seclore, structured, let's say with Titanium. Now you have a baseline on which you can manage a smaller set of policies like Kevin mentioned, and maybe you have a paradigm that gives you you can have, wrap your arms around that a little bit better as a CISO. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think reduction looks like that, right? Reducing the complexity of the policies and the amount of data that you're handling, right? In some sense, solving the problem at source, right, seems to be coming out as a consistent theme. Kevin, and more generally everybody, but Kevin, over the last 2 days, we've heard some of the largest enterprises in the world talk about collaboration with third parties and how it can be secured. And specifically when this is a completely borderless kind of environment, everybody's working from home, and that includes the contractors and third parties. What happens to the whole data discovery, protection, tracking paradigm in this new world, right? Where there is no boundary here.
Yeah, a lot of it we've already hit on. I mean, it gets back to eliminate all the noise and just get down to identity, access, and data, manage those things. Identity, I'm going to have a role versus a contractor versus an employee that'll be identified there, which should dictate access and should dictate data. So a lot of that stuff we've covered, but the other part is at a file level, understanding what that data is. So in the unstructured world, you can say I've got access to a folder, but what if there's files in the folder that shouldn't be there? And that's something that we can't go ahead and control. And maybe a contractor is not allowed to see a particular file type, but an employee can. So what happens in our world, which lives in Discover It, that it's this classification, and it's actually context-rich classification. So it's not just top secret or confidential, but it's actually embedding the metadata in it that can say, this is where I found it. These are the types of elements that are in it. And then by policy, be able to say, if I'm a contractor, can I see it? No, but if I'm an employee, I can. So being able to put a granular level of visibility that other machines and other technology can read, so those files can be treated with a different level of granularity based on that identity and access paradigm. You've got to have intelligence inside the file, which is provided through accurate discovery and context-rich classification. And the last part of that leg is always making sure that you don't have 16 copies of something you only need one of. So back to minimization. So we hit on a lot of this stuff. And I think if you strip away all the noise, identity, access, and data, you get that right, then it's going to, your concern about blurring lines gets a lot clearer in terms of what you're trying to solve for.
Yeah, I think the blurring of the lines is, again, based on the traditional definitions of perimeter, right? That there is a contractor and there's an employee and there's a line which divides the two, or there's a governed device and an ungoverned device and there's a line that divides the two, and similarly for applications and so on. And if we don't even try to draw that line and draw the line on the data access identity, right, that layer, then maybe the lines are still pretty clear, right? Yeah, I think that's very valuable insights. Jim, any thoughts on this? You've been in this world for this whole discovery, tagging, protection world for the last many years. What have you seen?
Look, I think Kevin nailed it. It's right on, and I also think, as we talked about, data continues to grow, and just because you've got new and lower cost means of storage, and you can have as much replication of data, doesn't mean you should be doing that, right? So I think when Kevin talks about policies that should maybe be a little bit more thoughtful about controlling how many copies of this can you make a copy of it, eliminating or making sure you've got really finite policy around data that is sensitive. It's easy to do, not easy. It is more advantageous and available to do the discovery when it's inside your applications, inside your network. And then where you're going to allow it to be shared, that's where you need to make the policy before those things happen, right? Because once it gets out, there's not much you can do about it.
Fair enough. Yeah, Aarti.
I was going to throw in a piece that is at least near and dear to you and I, Michelle, which is on the key management side. And I bring up key management as central to encryption because it is a set of controls that sits outside and separate from the entity that's using and processing that data. So in your world where a first party is giving data to a third party, right, like company contractor, company partner, retaining controls around those keys becomes critical to the conversation. So in your world, for example, when you are wrapping files unstructured with encryption and then using that to control, you're actually isolating that control, and it makes a tremendous difference. Because otherwise, you just have a contract vehicle to enforce your third parties, honoring your data protection. Likewise with us, right? So I wanted to sort of throw that out because we're out here planting ideas for people that are listening. That what you do with your keys and making sure you can do some sort of a BYOK, some sort of way to turn on and turn off access and use of your data when it's with third parties can be really powerful. Because as we have seen, right, in our world, you might be extorted for data that was not with you, but with a partner. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and I think we did a survey a couple of years ago where we found that 50% of the enterprises have been breached, not because of what they've done within the enterprise, but the extended value chain around the enterprise, right?
Yeah.
And 2/3, about 66% of the enterprise don't even know a full count of external partners and contractors that they actually share the data with, right? And then it becomes reading through NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and so on to discover what kind of information is going to what kind of external parties.
Well, let's add another degree of difficulty to that, because Artie's right. Now let's add the privacy on top. Where does the data reside? Where does the data owner reside? So I've got residency I have to understand. Based on residency, can a contractor that's maybe based in another country that doesn't have the rights to see that data, can I enforce that? What about data retention? How long do I have to keep the laboratory records based on the country and based on the data owner? So there's a whole degree of complexity going on top of this data, which is why I need to minimize it in the first place. But it's much more than just can I use it or can I use it? It is who am I? What country am I in? Where did the data come from? Who's the data subject responsible for that? And there's a whole string of regulation that follows that. So it's a hard problem to solve.
Well, I think I think what's interesting is that this group is sort of representing the different elements you need to make that machine work, right? So for example, you need to minimize your data, you need to figure out policy and who should get to see what, and then you need some enforcement mechanism, right? What's the point of having all of that figured out if you can't really enforce it, right? So I think this is an interesting panel for that reason, because Vishal, you assembled people that do like different pieces of this. So that's really, you sort of have to break it down into those pieces, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the idea. All right, some crystal gazing now as we come to the end of the session. If each one of you was advising the CISO of a large enterprise on how to prepare for cybersecurity threats a decade from now, what would be your recommendations? Top 2, top 3 recommendations of what does cybersecurity look like 10 years from now? Let's start with you, Arti.
I would actually echo the theme of this panel, which is you think you don't have control over your data today, wait till 10 years from now, where there will be too much of it and so much of it that what control you have now is also not going to be there. So you actually have to devise your data structures to be self-protecting. And so think about inserting all of your data protection into the data itself and start that now, because it will be difficult to do it later. And of course, I'm from the world of encryption, so I would say figure out how to encrypt your data in use. You got to do that, because no one's stealing disks, physical media from data centers anymore. They're coming in with credentials. So
that's true.
That would be my take. Yeah.
All right, Kevin.
Good. I figured Jim was going to steal all mine, so I'm glad you picked me next. Just a couple things. So first of all, you should have proportionate protection based on the value of your data. You don't want to spend the same amount of money to protect, like I said, the lunch menu versus a tax return. And as this whole panel has said, limited resources across the board, both in terms of people and in terms of money. So focus your security efforts around the most valuable things that you need to go ahead and protect, whether it be on the structured side, unstructured side, but get that right. And in that same picture, which we see every single day, tech debt will leave you vulnerable. I get phone calls regularly saying, Kevin, can you scan this tandem mainframe? No, get rid of that. It shouldn't still be there. We shouldn't have data in that, but they have all this stuff they've inherited 15, 20 years ago that's going to leave them incredibly vulnerable to anybody that wants to get in that gets credentials, to Artie's point, that they're not going to be able to put modern security controls around. So get rid of your tech debt. And then the last one that it's probably on all of our websites someplace. It's not a matter of if you'll be breached, it's when. That's no longer the paradigm. It's how often. Yeah. And when you have to think about how often am I going to get breached, it changes how you're going to react to them, and it changes how you're going to manage for them. It's not this black swan event that's going to happen once every 15 years or in a lifetime. It's going to happen maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on what business you're in. It could happen once a month. So how do you treat that in a very different fashion than how we've done it historically, which is nobody's going to get in, so I should be okay. And on a really rare occasion that maybe they do, I'll deal with attorneys and my cyber insurance. It is now a how often conversation, and they got to prepare for that.
Well said. Couldn't agree more, Kevin. Jim?
Yeah, look, I think number one, there's a lot of noise out there for CISOs that they have to deal with, right? You've got, as we talked about earlier, you've got the external regulation and compliance and different industry standards that is coming at them all the time. You've got the board of directors worried about what Kevin just talked about, how often they're being breached and what they're doing about the privacy issues. And then you've got over 3,000 cybersecurity startups out there because there's so much money in this industry, throwing lots of noise at them, right? And everyone's saying that they're the right solution. I think the best advice that I could try to give to the CISO to prepare for what is going to just continually get harder is to look at NIST, look at zero trust, look at the steps that they should take, and don't do it as I'm doing this because it's my job and I'm going to just satisfy a compliance or a requirement. Do it as if though you're passionate and this is your product, because it's really what has become, right? That this cybersecurity needs to become part of the fabric every day of the company, and it shouldn't just be the CISO's duty. So the more that it's ingrained in all of the personnel inside the company, and there's buy-in from the entire company that the things that they're doing around data protection, which is where it starts, are necessary in order to keep the company viable. Otherwise, it's just how bad is the breach going to be, right? Or when is the one that's going to actually impact them financially or cripple the company?
Very well said, Jim. And I'll add on to this. I think the biggest challenge in enterprises today that we see is this significant security demand supply gap on skill sets, right? So every security team in every enterprise has 10 times more work than they can possibly do, right? And this debt that is building up, the security debt, right, as parallel to the tech debt, there is a security debt that is building up every day, right? Because work that is required today and it's not done because there are no skills and so on is piling up, and it's becoming worse tomorrow, right? So one of the first things that I would tell the CISO of today is start worrying about skilling and training the resources that you have. That's one, and create and invest enough, because it's like every software company wants to get a 5 years experienced engineer, and nobody wants to deal with the first 5 years of the engineer, right? That's somebody else's problem, and that's the exact same phenomena that we are seeing much worse in the security world. And correlated to that is I would advise to start investing and start getting used to dealing with higher and higher levels of automation, right? So any technology that requires security professionals to come in and manage the technology or deploy the technology or do anything to do with the technology is going to become the bad apple very quickly. And it doesn't matter, it almost doesn't matter how valuable the technology or the value that it is delivering and how well it is supporting your digital transformation projects. If it requires an army of people to deploy or manage, that's a bad idea. And it's going to become worse as the skill gap becomes worse in the security industry. And the third for me would be maybe the logical next step would be to start looking at more and more machine learning kind of algorithms to come and take in instead of hiring or deploying more and more resources on a particular. So automation in general, right? Because there is a significant skill gap, security professionals, from compensation to skill level to everything is becoming worse for the CISO today than it was yesterday. And it'll become worse tomorrow and much worse 10 years from now. The only option here is to invest more and more into methods of automation which require the need for having this kind of large teams of security professionals hired within the company, because it almost doesn't matter, right? Whether you're trying to hire or you're trying to get contractors or third parties or whatever, the world is running short of security professionals by an order of magnitude, right? Which is probably great news for the security professionals out there, but not so good news for the to the CISOs and the companies who are hiring.
Yeah, truth.
Right. Hey, thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks a lot, Kevin, Aarti, Jim, for coming and spending time. This has been a very engaging panel. I don't know if you can see, but there's a halo right here already forming behind my head. Yeah, so I really appreciate your time. I think the audience here, which is security professionals from all around the world, will be truly appreciative. And for everybody here who's listening in, I think all the companies that you see here represented are excellent companies. They're leaders in the space. And if anything that Jim, Kevin, Aarti, or I have said sounds interesting, you should look at some of the sessions that have already happened. We'll send you the recordings, and feel free to participate in the forthcoming sessions. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot, Jim, Kevin.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Aarti.
Thanks. Bye.
Hey, thanks a lot, Vishal, and hello, everybody. I'm Jasbir, and I lead Seclore's practice over in Europe. And I'm going to do the final wrap of this incredible last 2 days from the Seclore kitchen. So I first want to just do a few takeaways that have really struck me. The first being that our customers are incredible. They're very innovative. They're using our technology in ways that we ourselves never imagined. Second thing is that any technology is only as good as the way it's been implemented and the way it's been used. And that we very clearly saw today. And the third thing is that collaborating with external agencies on confidential data is no longer an option. A company has to be able to do that. So while I try to think of all the interesting things I've heard today, I try to summarize a little bit. And it brings me to a story that has always impressed me. And it's about the great man Einstein, who we've all heard of, who also, apart from being an incredible physicist, was also a lecturer at numerous universities, one of them being over here in Zurich at the ETH. And one year when serving out the final exam for the graduating class, the paper's been spread out, and the assistant ran up to Einstein and said, hey, Professor, I think we've made a terrible mistake. We've given them the same exam sheet as we did last year, so the questions are the same. Einstein looked at him a little bit wondering, and then smiled and said, yes, that is true. The questions are the same because the problems are the same. What has changed is the answers, or the way we try to solve these problems. So taking that into account, let's try to think of what are we trying to achieve here. So what we're trying to do is see how can we protect data. And in our case, protect data once it's in a collaborative mode, so working with people outside our company and outside of our reach. So, like Doc and Marty would do, let's go back to think forwards. So back to the future. Okay, so how did we used to do this? In the old days, we built a fort if we could afford it. Otherwise, we lived in our cave. Nowadays, we have a house, an apartment, and we try to lock things up that we think are valuable. We try not to let people in who we don't possibly trust, or we watch what they're doing at least. That's when we have data in the house. Once our data started moving, we went on trips, we started using a number of things. We would wrap up or we would pack our suitcase in a particular colored suitcase of size so that we could identify it at the end. We'd put a tag on it so that we'd recognize that it's ours, and then we could prove to other people that it was ours. We'd lock the contents, and we'd have a key or a secret code that could be used to reopen it. So that's how we did it in our own lives. In the corporate world, it was actually very similar. So we built a campus. We had a data center. We had, controls of who went in there. We videotaped who went in there. We had the machines and the data processing and the data itself all within that campus. We used many technologies to do that, but from an IT perspective or from a data-centric perspective, we used three main technologies to try to keep that data there. First was encryption. So we try to make sure that when we shared data with people within the organization that we trusted, we locked it using encryption. The second thing was we used classification. We tried to classify the different pieces of data into different sets of importance, or as an example, colors, so we could find them, we could sort them. The third thing is we use DLP, or data loss prevention, to stop data from going out, to stop data leakage. That all worked great, so long as the data and we and our equipment were all actually within that office. Today that's changed. Well, it's changed a few years ago. And there are numerous different things pushing us. The first is that we collaborate. We don't just work with people within our organization, within the office. We work with many agencies and partners in other locations outside of our control. Second thing is that we do a lot of this work now. Our data, but also the applications processing the data, is no longer within our boundary. We're not controlling it. It's somewhere in the cloud. Then we also use nowadays what we call bring your own device. So you're using your laptop, your daughter's telephone or mobile phone. So our IT no longer controls the device where you're processing, creating, changing that data. And the fourth thing here would be that we have the work from home, which, a couple of years ago we said work from hotel. COVID has changed things. It's actually accelerated this, I think, more than changed. So we no longer work within the office anymore. We're working somewhere. So this is, really this is a big change. And at the same time, we have a fifth element pushing on us, which is regulations, new regulations, which are very, very data centric. So they very much tell you that you are liable, you have to control, you have to be able to audit who did what, when, and where with your data, but also with your partner's data, your employees' data, and your customers' data. So when you see all of this, that's probably kind of difficult. In security, we always say there's always a weakest link, and you should try to fix that weakest link. Well, here that weakest link is actually plural. Your data, your equipment, your partners, they're all outside of your control. So, how do you try to even find that weakest link? Well, I think, the conclusion to me is, after listening to all these interesting panels and use cases, is that there is, a number of points that come out of there. The first thing is that it's nearly impossible now to be able to control your third parties, where the devices, where the networks, where the applications, who are the people touching that data. Second thing is that DLP classification encryption, as we know them as standalone products, are not going to help in third-party collaboration. DLP actually will block collaboration because it won't let the data go out. Classification will raise red flags by telling your partners, but also maybe the bad guys, that this data is important for you. And encryption is great. We use encryption. Everybody uses encryption to protect things, digital data. But encryption is binary. To use it to collaborate with multiple people in multiple locations with multiple rights for different documents is impossible. The other thing that's already very clear is that being able to monitor, what the third party is doing with your data is very, very critical when it comes to compliance. If you don't know what they're doing, it's very difficult to build a case. And then, lastly would be logically that no amount of contracts and NDAs are going to help you or compensate for your loss when you actually have a breach. And that loss can be, reputation, it can be financial, but all these contracts are not going to help afterwards. So the only way you can protect yourselves to collaborate with third parties in the cloud and beyond would be actually to use a data-centric solution like Seclore. So having said all of that, I'll go back to one of my favorites, Einstein. I very much respect logically. Heraclitus, the wonderful Greek philosopher, is also a favorite of mine. And he said, change is the only constant. And I think we can learn a lot over here. As Einstein said, for us, the challenge to protect our data hasn't changed. What has changed is the methods, because the data is no longer in our control. Okay, having said all of that, I'd like to end the session. I'd like to thank all of the people who have joined us, customers, people who are interested in what we're doing. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate you spending time with us. And then, of course, I'd like to really thank our partners and also some of our customers who have taken part in a lot of the active, the use cases, the panel talks. They've contributed a lot and are always helping us get better. And lastly, logically, certainly not least, it's the employees who helped put together this incredible show, but all the employees at Seclore were working tirelessly to help you secure your data and to help us reach our goal, which is help the world protect its data. So having said that, I'd like to say thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you next year. Bye-bye.